Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I grew up in a pretty typical family. My dad worked hard his whole life and bought a house in Puerto Rico years ago, way before we moved to the mainland US. My older sister and I were supposed to inherit it someday. My brother, who my grandparents actually adopted legally, making him my dad's brother technically, stayed behind in Puerto Rico and took care of the property for us. He'd mow the lawn, trim the hedges, make sure everything stayed in decent shape. We paid him a little for his trouble, and everyone was happy with the arrangement. Our neighbor in Puerto Rico, she had a son. This guy was in his 30s, married with a kid, and apparently the only one working in his household. His wife didn't work because he didn't want her to. I guess she was fine with that setup because word was she wanted another baby even though they were always struggling financially. Back in 2021, my dad felt sorry for them. They were living in some cramped apartment and always complaining about money troubles. So my dad made them an offer, told them they could stay in our Puerto Rico house rent-free if they just maintained the property. Seemed like a win-win situation to me. But the son's wife took one look at the house and wrinkled her nose. Said she didn't like it. Too small. Too old. Not what she wanted. So they turned it down flat. We didn't think much of it after that. Life went on. Then last week, everything exploded. My mom's phone rang. It was the neighbor, the son's mother. She launched right into this whole speech about how her son had a witness who could confirm that my dad had offered them the house rent-free. She said he wanted to accept now. Then she started complaining about how neglected the property was, how vines were growing all over the electrical wires from the light post, how it was blocking the street, how it looked terrible. My mom was confused. My brother had been sick recently, sure, but he'd been keeping up with the basic maintenance as far as we knew. My mom explained that she couldn't make any decisions about that house because it belonged to her husband, and eventually it would go to her daughters. She told the neighbor she didn't have any authority over it. The neighbor insisted that my dad had made an offer and her son had a witness. My mom asked if she could send photos of these vines she was talking about. The neighbor said she would, but the photos never came. My mom started getting suspicious. She called my aunt who lives a few blocks away and asked her to go take some pictures of the property. My aunt did, and when she sent them over, yeah, there were some vines on the wires, but they weren't blocking anything. Cars were passing through just fine. My mom showed the photos to my dad. He's bedridden now, his health isn't great, and honestly every day is tough for him. But when he heard about this conversation, he got upset. He said that was their chance back in 2021, and they had said no. He told my mom he didn't want them anywhere near that house now, especially after how they acted. My mom asked my dad to call my brother. Turns out there was a whole other part of this story we didn't know about. A few days before the neighbor called my mom, her son had showed up at the property while my brother was there working. My brother had been taking care of those vines. He just hadn't mentioned it to us because it wasn't a big deal. He had it handled. But the son confronted him anyway. The son told my brother that our dad had offered him the house rent-free and he had a witness who was there when it was said. He said he was accepting that offer now. My brother reminded him that he remembered that day and he also remembered him and his wife saying no because she didn't like the house. The son got agitated. Then he started oversharing, going on and on about his problems. Turned out they'd been living in a church basement rent-free for 2.5 years. The church had let them stay there so they could save up money to buy their own place, except they hadn't saved anything. Now they were being evicted because the church needed the space. He was desperate. Then the son said something that really crossed the line. He told my brother that when our dad passes away, he wanted to buy the house from us at a low price. That was too much. My brother wasn't about to let this guy go behind my dad's back and try to scheme his way into our family property. My brother explained to him that he needed to understand something important. He told him that he was legally adopted by our grandparents, which made him our dad's brother, not his son. He made it clear that the son had no claim to the house whatsoever. Then my brother suggested that maybe It was time for the son's wife to get a job since their kid was going to be in kindergarten soon and she could work. The son didn't like hearing that. The conversation went nowhere. My brother cleared some branches from the abandoned property next door and left. He didn't tell my dad about it because he didn't want to upset him. He figured the message was clear enough, but it wasn't. This whole situation started eating at me. The entitlement was insane. These people had turned down a generous offer, and now years later they wanted to just waltz in and take what wasn't theirs. And the part about wanting to buy the house cheap after my dad died, that was disgusting. My mom was planning to move back to Puerto Rico after my dad passed. She wanted to sell our house here in the US and retire there. The last thing I wanted was for these people to harass her. I decided to fly down to Puerto Rico myself to check on the property and maybe have a conversation with this guy if he showed up again. I wanted to make it crystal clear that he needed to back off. Sure enough, I'd only been at the house for an hour when he came stomping up the driveway. His face was bright red and he was already yelling before he even reached me. He shouted that the house should be his and that my father had promised it to him. He kept saying he had a witness. I tried to stay calm and explain to him that the offer had expired when he turned it down. I told him the house had other plans and it wasn't up to me or him. I said it belonged to my father. He called us all liars and screamed that we were keeping what was rightfully his. I told him that nothing here was rightfully his, and he needed to leave. Then he lost it completely. He lunged at me, I guess trying to intimidate me, or maybe actually attack me. I'm not sure what his plan was. I dodged to the side and on reflex pushed him back. He stumbled over a chunk of concrete that had broken off the driveway and went down hard. His head hit the ground and he just lay there, not moving. My heart was pounding. I stood there for a second, completely shocked. Did that really just happen? I checked to make sure he was breathing. He was, but he was out cold. I called for an ambulance. They came and took him to the hospital. Thankfully, he was okay, just had a concussion and some bruises. The paramedics asked what happened and I explained the whole situation. They nodded like they understood. Here's the crazy part. When he woke up at the hospital, apparently his mother was there and she was furious with him. My aunt heard about the whole thing through the neighborhood gossip chain. Turns out the mother hadn't known about him harassing my brother or trying to go behind everyone's backs. She had believed her son when he said the offer was still open and we were just being difficult. But when the hospital staff and witnesses explained what actually happened, that he had attacked me on our property and I had defended myself, she was mortified. The mother actually called my mom a few days later to apologize. She said she had no idea her son had been lying to her about so much. She said she was embarrassed and promised he wouldn't bother us anymore. Apparently, she laid into him pretty hard at the hospital and told him he needed to get his act together, get his wife working, and stop expecting handouts from everyone. For now, things have quieted down. The son hasn't come around again. My brother says he hasn't seen him at the property. My mom's relieved, and so am I. My dad doesn't need this stress in his condition, and honestly, none of us do. I'm flying back to the mainland tomorrow, but I feel better knowing that this guy got a reality check. I just hope it stays peaceful from here on out because my mom's gonna need that when she eventually moves back. I lived in a rural Midwest community, and my ex-husband and I had just purchased a 10-acre farm to grow his business. We bought and sold livestock and desperately needed the space to expand. Moving day was chaotic, boxes everywhere, animals to settle, and a million things on our to-do list. On the first or second day of moving in, an older couple from next door stopped by. They looked to be in their late 70s, friendly enough at first. The wife immediately zeroed in on our driveway and complained about all the mud. She mentioned that the previous owners never did anything about it. Then she told me that she and her husband owned a gravel business and offered to send her son over to measure the driveway and give us a good price with a neighbor's discount. I thanked her and said we'd appreciate an estimate. I thought it was nice of them to offer. We'd already moved some livestock into the barn, about 10 small calves and a couple of horses. They were confined to the barn area while we readied the rest of the property. A few days later, her son showed up with a measuring wheel and gave us an estimate. The neighbor's discount turned out to be a couple $1,000s, more than another estimate we'd already gotten. Since this was our first home and money was tight, we went with the other company. My ex-father-in-law was an equipment operator with access to a dozer, so he brought it down and we had the stone delivered from the cheaper company. About 2 days after the gravel was laid, there was a knock on my door. A woman in official-looking clothing stood there with a clipboard. She introduced herself as someone from the state agricultural department and said they'd received a complaint that we recently brought in several cattle from out of state without proper transport documents. My stomach dropped. This was serious business. I told her I had all the documentation and rushed to get it for her. I'd learned early on to keep meticulous records. I pulled out my files and showed her everything: transport documents, health certificates, veterinarian information. I asked if she could tell me who made the complaint. She checked her paperwork and showed me the name. It was the older woman from next door. My blood ran cold. So this was payback for not using their gravel company. The inspector came back the next day and confirmed everything was in order. She told me we were good to go and that everything checked out perfectly. About 2 months later, the township supervisor knocked on my door. He said he'd received a complaint that we had too many animals on our property and we were violating township ordinances. I reminded him that I'd spoken to him before we even purchased the farm, told him our plans, and he'd said it would be fine. He acknowledged this but said the ordinance was specific and there was nothing he could do. Then he asked if there was a way we could acquire more land, and his tone suggested he was hinting at something. I asked what he meant. He explained that the township ordinance said that if we had 20 acres, we could have as many animals as we wanted and no one could challenge it. I understood what he was suggesting. We spoke to our other neighbor on the opposite side and got a lease for an additional 10 acres. We didn't use it, but it satisfied the township requirement. Another week passed, and animal control showed up. He told me he'd gotten an anonymous complaint that our dogs weren't being taken care of. The caller said they were skinny and came begging to the neighbor's house for food. I explained that was impossible because our property was fenced and sat on the highway, so there was no way they could get to the neighbor's house. I showed him their food and water bowls, both full. My 2 male dogs were in the kitchen, visible through the glass door between rooms. I warned him that my 2 boys would lick him to death and jump all over him. I also mentioned that my female didn't like men and would circle him and make awful noises, but she was harmless. He said he wasn't worried. I opened the door and the boys immediately jumped on him, covering him with kisses. He checked them over thoroughly and told me these were some of the best-looking dogs he'd ever been called to check on. He said they were well-built and clearly well-fed. I asked if he needed to see the female. He said no, he was good, and that she was doing exactly what I'd said she would. He admitted he wasn't touching that dog. Since the complaint was specifically about dogs, he didn't need to see my other animals. After he left, I contacted a lawyer I knew through the horse community. I asked if there was anything I could use to protect myself legally. Once I told him I had 10 acres, he said I was covered by the Right to Farm Act in our state. I went full detective mode. I printed out the entire 170-page act and started highlighting relevant sections. The act superseded any local governing. I decided I wasn't going to back down anymore. We hosted a youth agricultural event at our home. Everything was contained on our property, clean and organized. 3 weeks later, we held a fundraising benefit for a close friend's son who'd been in a terrible car accident and wasn't expected to walk again. I created an event page online and we organized a pig roast, live and silent auctions with over 250 items. About 300 people showed up and we raised over $10,000 for the family. Within days, we got a cease and desist letter from the township. The police visited, the health department came. The youth association I'd hosted the event for called me. Their president said the older woman had called him threatening to sic her lawyer on him. He told me she was screaming that the event was so disruptive that our loudspeakers shook her house. I explained that was impossible. Our speakers were cutting in and out all day and the kids could barely hear them. Plus, the event was on the opposite side of our property from her house, with my house in between. I couldn't even hear the speakers from inside my own house. The health department agent arrived next. She said she'd received complaints that we had multiple campers dumping their waste on the ground, and that our place was trashed. She also mentioned complaints that we were serving food to the public without a license. The first thing she noticed was how spotless everything was. We walked to where people had parked during the event, and she saw there wasn't even a napkin on the ground. She asked if the event was by invitation. I explained that technically, yes, I'd created an online event and made flyers that said, "You're invited" in big bold letters at the top. She told me that since it was private and invitational, those rules didn't apply. The police came to tell us someone had turned around in the neighbor's front yard and caused damage, but when they arrived to see it, her husband had already fixed it. I decided to try talking to her directly. I walked over and knocked on her door. When she answered, I told her I was sorry if anyone damaged her yard during the event and that I'd like to make it right. Before I could finish, she started cursing at me like a sailor, calling me a little girl and accusing me of doing whatever I wanted on my property. She went on and on about how I was bringing down the neighborhood. I responded and told her that for a grandmother who talked about how important she was in the community, she sure had a foul mouth. I said I refused to stand there and listen to that and walked away while she was still yelling. The township scheduled a hearing. I showed up with 3 2-inch thick binders full of documentation. The older woman was sitting right next to the township lawyer, looking smug and entitled like she'd already won. The board opened the hearing and she immediately stood up. She ranted about the events we were holding, claiming they drew drugs and alcohol and bad behavior. She demanded that the events be stopped immediately. I stood up with my binders and pleaded my case. I explained that I was covered under the Right to Farm Act and that agricultural events were specifically allowed under this act, which superseded local ordinances. I told them the youth event maintained strict rules. Participants had to maintain a certain grade point average, and if they were caught with drugs or alcohol, they were immediately expelled. I also read a letter from the youth organization president about his interaction with the neighbor, and he'd reiterated the rules of the program. Then a man I'd never met stood up from the audience. He said he lived on the other side of this woman and had no issues with any of our events. However, he said he did have an issue with getting a letter in his mailbox that wasn't stamped or properly mailed. Apparently, she had put letters in all the neighbors' mailboxes asking them to show up to the hearing and vote against us. He told everyone she was lucky he didn't call the law because it was illegal to put unposted mail into someone's mailbox. He announced he was going to get me a copy of the letter. She tried to grab the letter from his hand and demanded it back, saying it was her letter. He asked what she was doing and told her fat chance. Her face went completely pale. The board discussed the matter and voted 8-2 in our favor. After the meeting, we talked to the man outside. We shook his hand and thanked him for speaking up. He told us the older woman thought she could control everything because of her business, and that it was a pleasure to help see her fall on her face. The township lawyer, clearly influenced by her, called me several times demanding proof of how I was covered under the act. After a few phone calls, I told him I didn't have to prove anything because I was advised by the local agricultural agency. I said he needed to prove how I wasn't covered and file a civil case if he thought he had grounds. I never heard from the township or the neighbor again. I've been driving for about 15 years now, but I still remember the first car I ever had. Not because it was special or anything, trust me, it wasn't. My parents bought it for me back in 2006 when I finally got my license. They did what most parents did back then, found the biggest piece of junk they could that would still technically get me from point A to point B. It was a mid-80s Geo Metro, gold-colored, though honestly the rust was doing its best to change that. The thing was covered in dents and dings, looked terrible, and one of the side mirrors was literally held on with duct tape. But hey, it ran, and my parents only paid $350 for it, so I wasn't complaining. I had just started my first job at Pizza Hut, nothing fancy, just making some spending money. One afternoon I was heading over there to pick up my paycheck. The sun was starting to go down and it was hitting my windshield at this awful angle that made it really hard to see. I was creeping through the parking lot way slower than I normally would, squinting just to make sure I didn't hit anything. Then out of nowhere, bam! This huge black Suburban just slammed into the front driver's side of my car while backing out of a parking spot. I mean, they hit me hard. My little Metro didn't stand a chance. The whole front end was completely smashed in. I was shaken up, but okay, thank God. The driver got out and I could already tell this wasn't going to be pleasant. She looked annoyed, like I'd inconvenienced her somehow. We both had insurance, so we called the police to get an official report filed. The sheriff's deputy came out, looked everything over, took our statements, and wrote it all down. When I got home and told my parents what happened, they were just relieved I wasn't hurt. The car was obviously totaled. You could see that just by looking at it. They started looking for another cheap car to replace it. A few weeks later, we got a letter in the mail from the Suburban Drivers Insurance Company. I remember my dad reading it at the kitchen table and just stopping mid-sentence. My mom asked what was wrong, and he told her that the other driver was claiming I was at fault. They wanted our insurance to pay for the damage to their car. He said the other driver was claiming I'd been speeding through the parking lot. I told my parents I hadn't been speeding at all, that I'd barely been moving because the sun was in my eyes and I was going super slow. My mom asked if I was absolutely sure, and I swore up and down that I'd been crawling through that parking lot. My parents believed me, but they wanted to make sure they had their facts straight. My dad dug out the police report and started reading through it carefully. Then he found something interesting. He pointed out that the deputy had noted that the duct-taped mirror fell straight down when the impact happened. My mom didn't understand why that mattered at first. My dad explained that if I'd been speeding, the mirror would have flown backward from the momentum. If it fell straight down, I had to have been going very slowly, or was completely stopped. I reminded them that was exactly what I'd been saying all along. My parents' insurance company sent a letter back explaining that I clearly wasn't at fault. They said they'd be willing to settle for the $350 they'd paid for the car a few months earlier. Seemed fair to me, but then the other driver responded. She refused to pay anything, said she was confident she wasn't at fault, and that if we wanted money, we'd have to take her to small claims court. My dad said fine, we would do exactly that. My mom asked if he was sure, pointing out that it seemed like a lot of hassle for $350. But my dad insisted it was the principle of the thing. He said the woman had hit their daughter and was now trying to blame me for it. So they filed for small claims court. But to do that, they needed documentation of the actual damage costs. They had to take my poor totaled Metro to an auto body shop to get an estimate for repairs. The guy at the shop looked at the car and shook his head. He told my dad that the door panel was destroyed, the front fender was toast, there was suspension damage, the tire was blown, and honestly, finding replacement panels for a car that old just wasn't going to happen. He said they'd have to custom repair everything. When my dad asked how much that would cost, the shop guy said about $4,000 was labor and parts. My dad's eyebrows went up, but he took the estimate. Before court, they actually reached out to the other driver one more time to try to settle things. They offered to forget the whole thing if she'd just pay the original $350 for the car. She refused, said she still wasn't at fault and she'd see us in court. Court day came. My parents brought all the documentation, the police report, the repair estimate, photos of the damage, everything. The other driver showed up looking pretty confident. The judge reviewed everything. He looked at the police report, read the deputy's notes about the mirror falling straight down, looked at the damage patterns, and made his decision. He announced that based on the evidence presented, it was clear that the other driver had failed to properly check before backing out of the parking space. He awarded my parents the full amount of $4,000 for vehicle repairs. The other driver's face went completely white. You could see the exact moment she realized what just happened. She started protesting loudly, asking how she could possibly owe $4,000 for that car. But the judge told her that was the cost to repair the damage she'd caused, and the case was closed. She tried to argue more, but it was over. She had to pay the full $4,000. My parents walked out of that courthouse trying not to smile too big. They'd bought that junker for $350, and now they were getting $4,000 for it. My dad said things had worked out better than expected. My mom said she almost felt bad about it, but my dad told her not to feel bad at all. He pointed out that the woman could have just paid the $350 and been done with it. He said this is what happens when you're too stubborn to admit you made a mistake. They used the money to buy me a much better car, still used but way more reliable, and with both mirrors properly attached. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.